Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show, day 250 of the war in Israel. Today, I've got Marco and Richard here with me. Now, we all know that as soon as something wonderful or good in the world happens, there are lots of nasty, awful people who need to come and try and ruin it. And today, we're talking about the raid or the rescue operation that happened in Gaza just last weekend with the IDF. My camera's lagging a bit. Can you guys hear me okay?
Just about,
Just a
yeah,
bit.
yeah,
Okay, you guys take over the intro just whilst I sort that out.
sure. So yeah, we're talking about and the fact that it's been framed by much of the media as the Nuseirat Massacre, and what we're going to do here is talk about why that's a false claim and why it's inappropriate, and of course why the narrative has been shifted onto that.
So I think we should start talking about what is a massacre generally. It's defined as an event of killing people who are not engaged in hostilities or are defenseless. Now, let's cover this one. The hostages, we're talking about the four hostages which have been released on Saturday, one of which was Noah
Argamani.
Argamani, who's famous for a video of the video capture at the Nova Festival. Now, they were held in a residential area of central Gaza, in a suburb called Nuseirat, which is also often referred as a refugee camp. Now, I invite you to go onto Street View or Satellite View and see what Nuseirat looks like. It's actually a built-in area with some trees, or street-lined trees, and big villas and big houses in there. This is by no means a refugee camp under other definition, because you don't see a single tent, you don't see any structure, any temporary structure. This is, for all intents and purposes, a part of town. Now, the hostages were held by a doctor. Noah was held by a doctor and his son, who was a journalist, who also wrote for Al Jazeera and wrote for other Western-based organizations. They were not only guarded by the two so-called innocent Palestinians, but they also had Hamas guards, armed guards, so much so that when the IDF put on this incredible feat of bravery and logistical prowess, they were immediately assaulted by the guards in the buildings. The other hostages, the other three hostages, were held in a building about 200 meters away, so 200 yards away. So, first of all, these people are not innocent because they support Hamas by default. They voted for Hamas, and they're still, by any poll, they're still supporting Hamas. Second, they take part into Hamas operation. In fact, Hamas pays the Gazans $20 a day in order to hold on to the hostages. And of course, we know that the hostages don't get fed very much. Most of the hostages were found with muscle wastage and physically not up to the best they could have been. And again, these people are working for Hamas. The Palestinians, the Western media can call them innocent as much as they like, but we all know that the people in a country which is at war with somebody else are the enemy. The same way the Germans were the enemy in the Second World War. You don't blame just the leadership of the Nazi Party. You blame the whole nation which supports such leadership. And this is the same. The people who support Hamas, people who pretend not to see what's happening in the neighborhood, are Hamas. And in fact, they're the Gazans as well. They're the same thing.
Now, to Marco's point about the refugee camp and the fact that calling it a refugee camp is erroneous in the first place, have a look at the thumbnail of this particular episode, because that shows a picture of it. It shows a mosque built in it. All the buildings are built out of breeze blocks and stone. It gives you an impression of what it's really like, rather than the fact that this refugee camp, as it's called, has been around since 1948, and of course that's why it's all built up. That's why it is actually a town. So it's and that's how the Guardian describes it, of course, since 1948, and they drop the built-up nature of it when they're describing it, and everybody just seems to use this refugee camp. And it's yet another way in which they, when they're talking about a hospital, they're ignoring the fact that it's got tunnels underneath and connections to Hamas held equipment and all that kind of stuff. And when they're talking about schools, they're ignoring the fact that within certain classrooms within schools, like the one that was hit the other day in Nuseirat, the Islamic Jihad were in one classroom, the Hamas fighters were in another classroom, and those were the classrooms struck by the IDF. So, but of course, people drop that context when they're talking about the school generally. I just wanted to start my comment by quoting the UNAID chief, Martin Griffiths, because he described what we're talking about here, the deaths in Nuseirat of Palestinians, as being at the epicenter of the seismic trauma that civilians in Gaza continue to suffer. Now, look at that terminology there, epicenter, seismic. It's like it's trying to pretend that Israel causes earthquakes and that therefore you should have the same sympathy for the victims of this earthquake as you would of a naturally caused earthquake where people are genuinely innocent. And that's part of the deception that takes place here. The language allows you to unpick the con going on, for example. So it tries to pay entirely separating these people from the complicity, from the ideology, from the willful blindness that they're pretending after the event, from the fact that they're in the IDF forces and Yamam as they're trying to rescue the hostages and escape with the hostages, both with RPGs, firing on the helicopters with anti-aircraft missiles, as well as within the streets and from the buildings themselves. So you cannot ignore all of that and then pretend you're in some disaster area that has been caused by another country just willfully coming in and attacking you for no reason, attacking you because they're rescuing the hostages that you took.
And even the attacking himself, they weren't attacking as such. They were defending themselves because they were those under fire by the innocent Palestinians. The innocent Palestinians were using RPG all around the compound, all around the houses in the area where the hostages were being freed from. So they had to get the Air Force to distract and try and create a bit of chaos on the ground in order to stop the RPG hitting the vehicles, the armored vehicles, which were holding the freed hostages and trying to protect the helicopter as it takes off. Now, the term massacre was actually introduced by Paul Borrell, which is the equivalent of the Secretary of State for the European Union.
I think his first name's Joseph.
Joseph Borrell, sorry. He's a Spanish guy. He's a Spanish politician who belongs to the Socialist Party. Now, the Socialist Party is the same party which is in charge now, and the Prime Minister
Pedro Sanchez.
Pedro Sanchez. Sorry, I've gone so totally blank. Is the guy who actually recognized the state of Palestine just a couple of weeks ago. So we know which side of the political spectrum it falls on. But these people, why are they focusing on the numbers of the victim? Already less than 24 hours after the operation which freed the 4 hostages, the British paper, The Guardian, published the numbers of dead and wounded in the operation, Palestinians dead and wounded. 274 dead, 698 wounded. Such a precision after less than 24 hours later. I mean, we know the Palestinians' number are compiled by Ministry of Health, which is just another branch of Hamas. So why are we still believing these people who make up numbers all the time? We've been through this a number of times. We know that they use a dodgy methodology to collect the data. We know that they lie about it because they want to make it look like Israel is evil. And why are they focused on these numbers? Well, we're going to talk about this in a second, but don't believe a word that Hamas says, because Hamas wants to see the civilians dead, because by showing dead civilians, people dead on the ground, they can make their propaganda points.
Yes, there was some reporting in the media in recent days about various kind of text messages that have been leaked from Yahya Sinwar, and it was being reported in tones of shock and disbelief that he was rather callous about the lives of Palestinians, that he considered them kind of worthy sacrifices to the cause. And again, the way it was written up, I think in the Telegraph, where I saw it was, shocking expose of the leader of Hamas. And it was just, all that could go through my mind was, have you been paying any attention at all to the way that Hamas treats its own civilians? I mean, let alone just in the last 8 months, but for the last however many years, 17 years. But on the point of the numbers is the major thing that's being brought up. And of course, that tracks with the rest of the way that the discussion around the conflict has gone on since October 7th. And people saying, oh, how on earth can the Israeli government justify killing 274 people, as you say, when only 4 people were rescued? Now, that isn't actually the way that I don't think they would approach any other war, really, or any other. If this were the side they were seeking to justify, I don't think that's how they would seek to justify it. But because they want to tear down the Israeli side and because they want to undermine it, I think that's why they're approaching it like that. And the thing that people need to be keeping in mind is that the responsibility of any just government is to protect its own people. That's what and it's to do that in principle. It isn't to have this kind of consequentialist kind of calculus where you're adding up the numbers of X people killed on the opposite side and the X number of people that you're saving on your side. And then if it balances out in a certain way, then it's okay. In principle, the Israeli government needs to take the actions to save its own people and to go and save those hostages. And if that means that a higher proportion of civilians on the other side die, then so be it. As much as that might be unpleasant and it's going to result in lots of pain and suffering and so on. And there's various videos of that being posted on Twitter right now. That's not the consideration that the Israeli government has to act upon. And if it does, then it fails in the responsibility it has to go and save those people. And put yourself into the situation of the Israeli hostages. If you were really in that situation and the Israeli government was your government, would you really want for them to say, oh, well, no, we can't come save you because there are people who are going to be caught up in the crossfire, or we're going to kill people who are actually Hamas operatives who are going to be counted as the civilian, in the civilian death toll and so on. Now, perhaps there are some people out there who are quite so self-sacrificial as they would tell their own government not to come and save them. But I think probably for enough people out there watching this, you would understand that you would absolutely want your government to come in there and rescue you.
Yeah, going back to the numbers, why are people focusing on the number? Because no one in the West who's not a psychopath will recoil at the knowledge that so many people are dying. But just the number is designed to make you have an emotional response of horror. So you start dropping your conceptual ability. You put reason on the side and you start responding emotionally. And by doing this, they effectively disarm you intellectually, because they can then make you believe that Israel is bad because of the numbers. The numbers are everything. The numbers represent, the biggest evil. But if you just stop and look at the number, looking at the picture of the rubble and the people moving in the rubble, you forget why there is a rubble, why those people are in the rubble, and what caused all this. They try and distract you from separating the cause of this horror from the consequence. Now, let's just stop October 7th. What happened on October 7th? The peaceful Palestinians invaded Israel and butchered, not scared. They didn't throw a bomb and kill 1,200 people. They butchered one by one. And then, not happy about this horror committed, bring back 250 human beings who are treated like slaves and pawns to be bargained in exchange for favors. So if Israel goes back and decides to defend its own citizens, as a legitimate government should do, it's got every moral right to pound Gaza. And even if every single civilian died, that or the fault of the people who started the war. And this is Hamas, the Palestinians who support them. So no numbers. It doesn't matter what the number is. Yes, it is horrible to see so many deaths, but the deaths are the death of the enemies of life, or the people who want to cause death and destruction because they don't want Israel to. They made it clear since 1948 when the UN declared the existence of Israel. And since then, they always refuse a peace agreement because they don't want to live with Palestine, with Israel. The Palestinians want their own territory and want the destruction of Israel because they are motivated by Islamic ideology. And Islam doesn't want Jews to exist.
I think one of the things Ayn Rand points out in her writing is when you're comparing two things together, you have to compare what's relevant. You have to compare the essentials together. Things have to be commensurate when you're comparing them. One of the words she uses when doing this. You can't drop the context. So, for example, when you're talking about 4 hostages were saved and a number of people died, many of which, of course, were literally the ones firing on the IDF and Yamam as they were trying to rescue and trying to escape. But even if we take some civilians in that number, which is undoubtedly true, and even the IDF acknowledges that you can't tell the difference because, of course, Hamas don't wear uniforms, they don't wear dog tags, they don't have different kinds of infrared heat sensors on Hamas officials as opposed to any civilian. And of course, they dress as civilians. And of course, civilians themselves, women and children, are also known to use weapons and act as decoys and etc. So, but even if we focus on a number of civilians dying in the course of this operation and the 4 being rescued, you can't drop the context. You have to be comparing commensurate things. So it's not like thinking of a rescue in terms of a rescue from people from a fire or people from a flood, where in rescuing a handful, you actually cause the death of many more in that kind of situation. And that's the kind of trick that's being played when the term rescue is being transposed over here in this context, and people are going, yes, but so many more died. Because they are the ones who were complicit in the ideology, in terms of actually many of them knowing the hostages were in the vicinity, because that's why they were with people who are armed, ready to defend the area should anyone come in, ready to fire at the sky at any trucks, any IDF forces in the area. So I think that's is really important to understand the language used and how things are sort of emotionally attached to other contexts, and they try to reference that, try to make you in the back of your head think of the different kind of setting and think, oh no, that is bad. 4 versus 100, 200, whatever the real number is, and of course that's just dropping all of the essential facts.
Yes, and the thing about the numbers is that it's all really a pretense, because if you're looking, before this I was looking on Twitter at the kind of usual suspects who are talking about this, and for all of these people, there isn't a individual number that would have been okay. If it were 4 Palestinian dead to 4 Israelis, they wouldn't have thought that was okay. Or if it were an inverse, proportion. So if it were 1 Palestinian civilian who had died to these 4 Israeli hostages who were saved, they wouldn't think that was okay either. And that's because they think that anything that Israel is doing is invalid. They think it's a colonial, apartheid, oppressor state, all of this kind of stuff. So they don't even think that Israel has the right to defend itself against the what do they call it, the armed uprising or the armed resistance to Israel from October 7th. So people should just keep in mind as well that there's something a bit dishonest almost about talking about the numbers. Maybe that's not in the forefront of the people's minds when they're bringing up these various things, and for when people in the West are kind of repeating it, that might not be quite so dishonest. These people are more just like useful idiots. But for the people who are really kind of hardcore on the Palestinian side, the numbers business is all just really a charade, and people need to keep that in mind. And the real perversity of them then going on to calling this a massacre is because if we look at the body cam footage like that we played on the Daily Objective just before this of them going to the building and saving the hostages, or even just some of the surrounding footage that's been posted on Twitter of people recording the operation on their smartphones, it doesn't resemble anything like a massacre. Now, there is a lot of heavy shelling that seems to have gone on in the operation, which seems to be where a lot of these casualties are coming from. But even that, I mean, that is an ordinary part of warfare, as terrible as that is, but that is part of the nature of warfare. Something that does resemble a massacre is all of the body cam footage that came out from October 7th. If people, if you have a strong enough stomach for it, if you've gone and looked at some of the footage from the Nova Music Festival, particularly surrounding the kind of bar area, or from the kibbutzim where the Hamas fighters are in there kind of really mutilating the bodies for fun, or the phone call of the Hamas fighter who calls home to brag to his parents about having killed Jews. That all of these things resemble a massacre. If you want to describe that as a massacre, I think that's much more appropriate. But an operation which is going in to save people's lives, and in which there is collateral damage or the killing of actual, terrorists who are trying to stop this from going on, it's not appropriate to call that a massacre at all. It is completely perverse, and it's one of these things which is just so awful to look at these publications like Al Jazeera we were looking at just before in preparation for this, to see them kind of parading this around, and for this to all just be eaten up by the Western media, who is really lockstep and followed suit. It's a deeply perverse thing, I think.
Yeah, and especially to have somebody like Joseph Borrell, who's a seasoned diplomat, to use a term like massacre. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly that he's lying. He's pure evil. He represents the kind of evil which we are tolerant about in the West nowadays. As I said earlier on, there is no excuse now on 250 days from October the 7th not to realize what's going on. We know that the hostages are held by Gazans. We've seen it. We've seen it a number of times. That's why the operation itself was performed where it was, in middle of a residential area in Gaza. We know that, for example, from the initial explosion in the car park of the hospital at the beginning of the war, that it was Hamas that's throwing rockets, and it was Hamas that caused that explosion, and the 500 victims mentioned immediately and broadcasted by the media in the West were made up. But anyway, even if they were there, they weren't anyway, they were caused by Hamas. We heard about the flower massacres when the Gazans attacked aid convoys and they killed a driver, totally innocent driver. We know that the siege of the Al-Shifa hospital, for example, lasted for weeks. Why? Because innocent Gazans were fighting back the IDF for weeks. They're so innocent. We know that the numbers for the Gaza Health Minister are made up. We know that the aid hijacks continue all the time. We know that they keep weapons in schools and hospitals. We've seen the thing where it's reported, it's admitted by all sides, but the press on the West try to distract you from that evidence. We know that UNRWA, the UN-funded organization, i.e. the organization funded by all of us, is providing weapons to Hamas. We know that it's providing refuge. They found tunnels in the HQ of UNRWA with a massive data center underneath. So, and we know that, as I said earlier on, that the kidnappers and the guards of the victims are Gazans. So how much more do you need? At what point will the West acknowledge that the Gazans are not good people? that the Gazas are the enemy. The Gazas are the people who are perpetrating these horrors. At what point?
I mean, it's Hamas that has made the battlefield this civilian environment. It is Hamas that has defined that the fighting has to take place here because that's where the hostages are. And you know, when the IDF and Yamam, etc., enter this area, they're entering hostile territory in order to extract the kidnapped people who've been kept within it. Now, I think when you look at the Al Jazeera reporting, there's a big question as to why even bother looking at Al Jazeera reporting. We all know it's a pack of lies. But if you actually look at Al Jazeera reporting, and then you look at like CNN or the BBC or whatever, you see how you see very clearly what the meaning is in the Al Jazeera. You see how it's tweaked and made more Western friendly, but still retains the essence of the Al Jazeera report in the BBC CNN report, and then that's how it's propagandized out to the world. So it's sometimes, to get it really clear, you need to go back and look at the Al Jazeera one, because that cuts out the trickery, to be honest. So I wanted to quote a couple of things from Al Jazeera. One was the fact that they described it as a bloody ambush that turned into a massacre. Now, the only a bloody ambush that has taken place has been the booby trapping of the building that killed 4 Israeli soldiers yesterday. And of course, that was a building that was a Hamas operative, with an entrance to a tunnel underneath. So that's the only, a bloody ambush. What, going in to rescue your kidnapped people is an ambush. Again, it's this gaslighting. It's this attempting to switch what you do onto what your enemy does, and then flagging up your enemy as being the evil one. I think one of the quotes I wanted to make was that the Israeli foreign minister, Israel Katz, said, "Only Israel's enemies complained about casualties of Hamas terrorists and their accomplices." Now that quite clearly lays out, the point of what's going on here. And one of the things that Hamas said in their reporting, and this goes to my point about, looking at the source, is they described after this operation had taken place, described the bewildered people of Nuseirat tried to comprehend what had happened. I mean, really? I mean, they were firing on the IDF. They were defending IDF. They knew the hostages were there. They hold the same ideology, as we keep saying. They cheered the taking of the hostages back on October the 7th themselves, as we've heard testimony of the hostages being brought into the area, as we've seen footage of people handing out sweets, etc. on October the 7th. We've seen the way that the joyous way in which the Palestinians, the Gazans, responded to the atrocities of October the 7th and the taking of those hostages in the first place. So then to pretend that there are bewildered people who know nothing about it, as if they're entirely disconnected from everything else going on. But of course, that's what the BBC and the CNN try to do. They try and separate them out into two, make them look like bewildered innocents. You can't buy a word of it.
I think what I find quite so exhausting about keeping up with the news coverage from the war like we do is that I think, as Marco was saying, we've had the Flower Massacre before, the reporting around the Al-Shifa hospital, where I think it was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, all these other little wannabe subgroups blew up the hospital, and then Israel got blamed for it. Is that the Palestinian side seems to really want to be kind of manufacturing these atrocities. Now, I don't mean that the particular things didn't happen, but I mean that they want to seize on something that did happen, spin it in a particular way, and then create this new kind of legend to bolster their cause. And I mentioned a few weeks ago, a kind of talk from an Israeli historian who was doubting that the Deir Yassin massacre ever happened in 1947. And, the massacre at Deir Yassin is kind of one of the founding kind of stories of the Palestinian cause, that, in the founding of the state of Israel, the Israelis decided just to butcher this innocent little village, right? Now, whether he's right about that, about whether it didn't happen, and there are Israeli historians who take it as an accepted fact. One of the things that he was saying was that he said he had discovered documents of this early kind of Palestinian Arab leader, who was saying just after the war in 1948 that he was deliberately kind of wanting to encourage the idea that this had been a massacre for political purposes. And I don't really know whether that's true. I haven't gone and read his book and see whether that's true. But that certainly tracks with a lot of the behavior that we're seeing kind of around the war since October 7th. There's a deliberate attempt to take things which really have happened where people have died and to spin it in a way that's saying, oh, the Israelis are just really out for blood. They just want to kill a lot of people. And the whole idea of calling this a massacre is to say that really the intention behind this was just to kill as many people as possible. In the Al Jazeera article, it was saying, I can't remember the exact word that they used, but it was something along the lines of this operation whose so-called intent or whose supposed intent was to rescue the hostages. Presumably the doubt there being that actually what Al Jazeera wants you to believe or thinks is that the IDF was really there just to kill as many people as possible, maybe get the hostages as a kind of secondary objective and then leave. But as if there's any evidence to support that at all, and as if that's not actually flying in the face of all the evidence we actually have. And as I say, there's something just, I don't know, what would you call it, just morally kind of being browbeaten every day or getting downcast about the fact that you're watching people confect absolute lies in front of you all the time about this for propaganda purposes. And it's unbelievable, really.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned 1947, 1948. Well, it's so irrelevant by now. Right now, there is a state sanctioned by the UN, Israel. And the nature of that particular state is to allow people to cohabit in peace. So you got Arab population, 2 million living in Israel, no Jews living in Palestine. All these old historic statements are totally irrelevant by now, because if you look at the actions of the Palestinians, so-called Palestinians, who claim they've been victim of a wrong, has been totally annihilated by their behavior since. They attacked all the Arab nations around Israel, attacked Israel the very day it was founded, when declaring independence. And since then, they refused every single attempt to create a peaceful solution. Again, October the 7th is another event where the ceasefire, the so-called peace there was between the Palestinian and Israel was broken by the action of the Palestinians, of the Gazans. So, well, if you start a war, you should expect to have casualties. So you cannot start a war then claim you have too many casualties, because it's on the state that started a war. And the war, you could argue, was started by the Arabs, who refused the existence of Israel at every step. But leaving aside the historical events, if you like, no one has got the right and the ability to claim victimhood status so much as the Arabs in Palestine, in so-called Palestine, are doing, because of their actions. The action disqualifies them from any kind of victimhood status. They are causing this war. They're keeping the war alive. They do not want peace, and they're demonstrating it step by step. That you cannot claim to be a victim at the same time as committing the atrocities that they are guilty of. For example, where's the so-called innocent Palestinians? Where is the dissident? Where is the person that's trying to escape? Where is the person who's trying to help Israel? Because this, again, the same problem during the Second War. Yes, you risk your life if you help the enemy of a legitimate state. Yes, if the Palestinians try and help Israel, they risk their life. But so did the French when they were helping the Allies against the Nazis. You don't have a chance. If your government is illegitimate, it does something illegitimate, you will suffer for those consequences. So if you don't agree with the government, your chances to help somebody, another government, especially when they declare war on that particular government of the state, you can help them to fight the illegitimate action of your illegitimate government. You cannot claim victimhood and at the same time be complicit to the atrocity that your state is committing.
As Marco referred to a little earlier, when we're talking about, mentioned the Flower Massacre, for example, and I'm loath to use these terms that are simply part of the propaganda of Hamas, but that's what we're unpicking here. We're unpicking the fact that they do use these terms and that they try, and it doesn't matter whether it's debunked in the past. And we did an episode on this channel, an episode was done on this channel, debunking the Flower Massacre at the time, talking about the stampede, talking about the fact that it was the aid trucks were driven by private contractors, and of course that they were ran at by the Gazans, and some of them were intending to attack the IDF that were shielding these trucks, and so they were preventing that from happening. But most of it occurred from the stampede, from the reaction of some of the truck drivers caught with their lives at risk, who were nothing to do with the IDF. So, but of course, all that needs to stick in people's mind is the term massacre. That was a massacre. This is a massacre. There'll be another massacre. And of course, all that needs to stick in people's mind is the idea that Israel is the cause of them, as opposed to Hamas being the cause of them, and the actions of the Gazans at each incident being the cause of them, and the action of the Gazans in supporting October the 7th, etc., being the wider cause for it all. And then in terms of the reporting, we mentioned the EU guy earlier, but whether it's the UN or whether it's people like charity organizations like Oxfam, when you get this mutual sympathy tweets, this kind of that goes, oh, we're so relieved that the hostages have been released and that they've been freed, and we're so sorry for all the civilians that were killed in the area. That moral equivalency of giving sympathy out regardless is the same as standing up for the butcher of Tehran at the UN after the death of the Iranian leader, and as if he deserves anyone's respect as opposed to everyone's opprobrium.
I think as well, these kind of propaganda confections or constructions, it should really give people a lesson in the necessity of being independent and thinking for yourself. Because I meet people occasionally who are tremendously second-handed and just rely on the opinions of others, and even some people who will explicitly talk about that. I was talking with someone the other day who was quite intellectual, who was telling me about how he really liked philosophy because it meant he didn't have to think for himself. He could just read all these books. And then suddenly he knew what he needed to know. And I asked him, what about when they don't agree with each other? And he didn't really have an answer. But so you meet people like that who are quite explicitly second-handed sometimes. And although we're not talking about, reading philosophers here, we're talking about reading the news. If you're someone who just was sort of very credulous and you were opening your newspaper or your newspaper app or whatever, or just coming across these articles online, no wonder we see so much kind of hysteria on the streets about Israel, and where Israel is treated like the pariah, is being treated like a pariah. I was getting my haircut the other day, and I like my barber a lot, really nice guy. And yet Israel came up, and he doesn't know my opinions on Israel very much. But just even though he wasn't especially bad on Israel compared to some of the things that we hear, his sort of I think he viewed himself as being kind of neutral on the issue. He said what his neutral point wasn't really even just, oh, there's some good on the Israel side and some bad and some good on the other side and some other. It was very much weighted towards the Palestinian side, because the whole kind of God, I can't speak today. Cumulative kind of effect of the messaging that's coming from the media is just to demonize Israel as this barbarous, murderous state that would really like to kill children. And believe me, guys, there's no anti-Semitism behind any of that at all. And the Palestinians are these, poor little weak oppressors who have done nothing. And okay, October 7th happened, but that was just done by their government. It wasn't done by them. And let's not question how their government got there. That is pretty much what comes through to a lot of people. And so when I do then tell people occasionally what my view of the conflict is, and I see their eyes kind of go wide and as if they've just suddenly seen a monster in front of them. Although that's quite frustrating. I almost kind of understand, because most people aren't engaged with reading this 24/7 and really kind of developing their opinions. And so given that there's all this proper propaganda around, people really need to develop their critical thinking skills and think all this kind of stuff through. I mean, even really what we're talking about here, although we're speaking about the content of the operation to save the hostages and saying why that doesn't match up to the description, really we're just kind of interrogating the name that people are slapping on it as a massacre. And you can't even concede that, really, because once you've done that, you've conceded almost everything else to them. So you need to really think for yourself about all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's why we have this pro-Palestinian phenomenon of the marches and the calls for intifada, the calls for death to America, all this kind of stuff that we have in the West, this kind of tribalism. People just react to us and them. They group themselves into a camp without really thinking why, without really thinking what's behind my choice. They just see the group that they think belongs to what they believe. But the issue is that when you argue for the pro-Palestinian side, what actually are you saying? You're saying that you want a state in the Middle East which will be created in contrast to Israel. And what's the essence of the state you want to create? What should Palestinian look like? Palestine would be a state which is formed on the hateful ideology of Islam, which wants the Jews dead. And after the Jews wants the spread of Islam and Sharia law and the reduction of freedom, the annihilation of freedom, the theocracy that they want to impose is ultimately the goal of having a state at all for the Palestinians. So why would you want to help the Palestinian cause if it means effectively helping Hamas in the short term and helping the destruction of civilization in the longer term? But they don't think that. They just see the flag, they see the children in the rubble, and they think that by being on the side of the weak, because they are poisoned by the morality of altruism, they think they're helping the weak one, you're helping the good one. But that's not the case. It's quite obvious that the weak one at this point is the evil one. It's pretty obvious. Just look at the events. Just look at what's behind the news. You don't have to dig that hard. Just look at what's happening, put it together, and you'll see where the evil side is, quite starkly.
And that's why it should be ended quickly, that evil side. I think just to pick up on what you were saying about having critical thinking, I think I like the way that Rand puts it in one of her essays when she talks about bringing your mind in focus. And that being what volition and free will is simply bringing your mind into focus. And instead of drifting and leaving it out of focus and just accepting whatever dirge is fed to you, getting it washed over you and accepting it as truth, that is the problem. And she makes a really interesting distinction between she rejects the phrase having an open mind or a closed mind for two reasons. Because if people talk about having an open mind, they can talk about being open to anything, any ridiculous conspiracy theory, such as the idea that you were talking about earlier, that for some reason this hostage rescue was just a cover for bombing the area or attacking the area, when a hostage rescue is an extremely difficult thing to pull off. And so the idea that side of it will be your cover is just patently ludicrous from the off. And there's zero evidence whatsoever. So having an open mind is not being open to anything with no evidence whatsoever. And having a closed mind, equally, being closed to evidence that does exist, being closed to reality, is not something that is going to get you to the truth. But having an active mind is. And having an active mind that goes into focus, as opposed to an inactive one that simply accepts whatever you've been told by Al Jazeera or its proxy, CNN, BBC, etc. That is the problem.
And thank you very much for the super chat, Jonathan, who gives $5. So we're just in the last few minutes, guys. Is there anything else we should let people know before we wrap up?
No, we should just remind people that there is no massacre in Gaza. There's never been a massacre in Gaza, certainly since October the 7th, because there's no innocent in Gaza to be killed unjustly. Every single death in Gaza is the result of the action of Hamas, and it's morally and legally fault of Hamas. The only innocent people in Gaza right now are the 120 hostages who are still there, held by the Gazans. And the only victim in the last few days in the rescue operation is Arnon Zamora, which was a member of the Yemen, who's effectively given his life, is being killed by these innocent Palestinians. He's given his life in order to save hostages, people who were taken from their home by the Gazans.
And of course, a lot of the information about how hostages were held and the conditions they were held in and stuff doesn't necessarily emerge immediately. Sometimes it takes a month or so before the IDF chooses to release that for good military reasons, because all of the intel that somebody can gather from how a hostage was held, where they were held, what conditions they were in, how they were treated, how they were moved about, all of those kind of things is the kind of intelligence that is necessary to enable operations like this to take place in the first place. So often when there's sometimes not the full information that everybody wants, and then points the finger at the absence of information to indicate some deception, it is simply, you've got to bring, again, your mind into focus and to understand what the bigger picture here is, and the fact that the IDF are trying to rescue as many hostages as possible. So absence of information is not proof of dodgy behavior or worse on the side of Israel, for example. So that's an important point to make. And I think also when it comes to a big tricky operation like this, when perhaps you do have to involve a decoy and a cover whilst you're trying to achieve your core mission of rescuing the hostages, that is equally legitimate. This is part of war in a military setting where you're trying to rescue your own people from hostile territory. And the fact that that hostile territory is the town is the fault of Hamas, and that's why you're there.
Yes, a lot of the world's media and people on Twitter had discovered that apparently it's really bad for the soldiers of an army not to be dressed in military uniforms. Where have you been for the last 8 months? Goodness gracious. So we have two more super chats. We have $5 from Jonathan, who says, "Thank you for mentioning active versus open mind. I heard Dr. Peikoff mention that on his podcast." And then we have £5 from Alexis Giannakou. Thank you very much, Alexis. Okay, guys. Well, since we're just in the last few minutes, we'll wrap up. Thank you very much for watching. Apologies for going out just a bit late today. There were some tech issues at the beginning that were just causing an issue, but I think I've discovered what the cause of them was. So hopefully they aren't going to trouble us very much in the future. We'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. Marco and Rich will be back here with you for certainly the reality show. I'm going to be flying to America for Ocon, so I hope I'll see some of you there. But we'll see you all back on the channel tomorrow, and yeah, we'll see you then. Anyway, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.